Amal Unbound, Chapters 23 and 24, read for you by Mrs. Shoemaker. Later that week I ran Nazarene Baji's bath and sprinkled lavender petals into the water. I laid out her clothes on her bed as she stepped into the bathroom. I glanced at the clock. I had 10 minutes. Slipping into my room, I grabbed the book hidden beneath my pillow. I tucked it under my shawl before heading downstairs to return it. After finishing a few poetry books earlier in the week, I had read my first biography, the story of Allama Iqbal. Omar would have laughed at me for picking up such a heavy tome, but choosing thick books meant I could hold on to them longer before I need to exchange them. And now I understood why Iqbal was Miss Saadia's favorite poet. It turned out he wasn't just a poet. He was also a politician, a teacher, a lawyer, a scholar, and a knight. I thought one dream was enough for a person, but reading his story, I learned some people could hold on to many different dreams and see them all come true. I went down the hallway leading to the library, past Tokir, the elderly servant who dusted the baseboards. He didn't even glance at me as I passed him. Slipping inside, I put the book back into its spot and ran my hands over the other titles. I paused at the thick black dictionary on the bottom shelf. Omar always wanted one of his own. He said dictionaries contained every word ever uttered. I pulled it out. It was heavier than expected. The paper was thinner than in other books, and the font was tiny. I smiled. What if I read this whole thing? What would Omar say when I told him I read all the words to ever exist? I heard footsteps. Tokir. I tightened my grip on the dust rag. My ready excuse for why I was here. But before I could slip the dictionary back onto the shelf, I saw it wasn't Tokir. It was Jawad Sahib. He stood at the entrance, blocking me. "What do you think you're doing here?" he asked. "I'm dusting." I gestured to the dust rag and tried to keep my voice from trembling. "And that's why you're holding my book?" His eyes narrowed. "I thought you'd learned your lesson by now, but I return home and learn my new servant has been stealing books from me? I have to say that takes a great deal of nerve." "Stealing?" I gasped. "Never!" "I bet you saw my books and thought they'd fetch a big price, right? But you could sell 1,000 of them and never make enough money to pay off what you owe." "I would never steal from you, Sahib. I borrowed some books, yes, but I returned all of them." "And who said you could walk in here and take my things?" My face flushed. He was right. "I shouldn't have," I said, "and I'm sorry. But these books, you have so many. There's dust gathering on their spines. I couldn't help it. Forgive me. I missed reading so much." There was a long pause. "You can read?" he asked. "Yes, of course." "Can you write as well?" I didn't know whether to be offended at his presumptions or relieved the storm clouds seemed to be parting, revealing blue skies and sunlight. "I can write. I can read. I know math as well." He studied me for a moment. "Full of surprises, aren't you?" But his words weren't filled with his usual contempt. "I can't remember the last time I read one of these books," he said as he walked to the bookshelf and examined the titles. "I might have been your age when I read A Stranger in Al-Alandus." He pulled the book from the shelf. "I loved this one. Read it so many times my father replaced my worn copy with a new one. He didn't realize I liked the feel of the old one." I tried to imagine him as a teenager, sentimental about a worn book. I couldn't. His mobile phone rang. He glanced at the phone and then at me. "I'm letting this pass," he said. "See, I can be a forgiving man, but don't touch my books again." He lifted the phone to his ear and motioned for me to leave. I stepped into the hallway. He let me go. He didn't punish me. Nothing had happened. Everything was fine. I should have felt grateful. But the thing was, those books were what made my days bearable. They were what helped me sleep at night without my homesickness choking me. Without books, What was there to look forward to? Chapter 24. Nazarene Baji had a migraine headache. I had spent half the night massaging her head, but it hadn't helped, and now she grimaced over lunch. I can draw a bath when you're finished, I offered. The steam helps sometimes. Rest will do more good. She clasped her hands to her forehead and stood up. Mumtaz has gone for the afternoon to visit her sister. Keep an eye on the kitchen until she returns. And tell Bilal I'll be in the library catching up on some work, Jawad Sahib told me. He shouldn't bother me unless I call for him. What kind of work? Nazarene Baji asked. Just some accounting and paperwork. But why? Zaid should be doing that. What do we have an accountant for? Whether or not he's an accountant is debatable, and the only one I can trust is myself anyway, he said. Then he looked at me. How are things going with her? He nodded toward me. Very well, Nazarene Baji said. She is a gift from God. Good. Glad it all worked out, Jawad replied. I'd settled dirty dishes into the sink, and I had just turned on the faucet when I felt a tug on my camise. Fatima looked at me. Her expression was somber. What's wrong? I turned off the water. I heard what happened yesterday, about the books. I flushed. Tokir must have told everyone all about it. So you know how to read? She asked. Yes, I learned at school. Could you teach me? I paused at the unexpected question. Baba said he could get me some paper and pencil. I glanced at Hamid. He covered a pot with a metal lid and rested his cooking spoon to the side. He gave a small nod. But I might not be able to learn, she continued. My mother used to say I wasn't very bright. She said it without any effect, as though it were simply a fact. I picked up a butter knife and held it out to her. What is this? I asked her. A knife. What kind of shape does it have? Long? Straight? That's the first letter of the alphabet. Olive. Olive, she said slowly. See? I said. You're learning to read already. I can teach you whenever we have time. It's not so hard, I promise. Her eyes widened. She took the butter knife from me and rushed off to show the cook. I finished the dishes and wandered out onto our veranda. With Jawad Sahib back, it was empty. Fatima's words kept coming back to me. Why would any mother say something so cruel? Something moved in the distance. I squinted. It was a cat, orange and white. I walked over to where it stretched out under the sun. Peaceful out here, isn't it? Nabila stepped outside and joined me in the garden bordering our veranda. She set down a metal bowl filled with milk on the grass. The cat walked over to Nabila, brushed herself against her, and purred. She's a stray. Nabila petted the cat. She wandered over my first week here. Been giving her milk ever since. I named her Chotu. She's pretty, I said tentatively. She is, Nabila said. When I first came here, I sat by those flowers any chance I got. She pointed to the flush of purple in the distance. I don't know their names, but they grew next to my parents' house. I would look at them, really fixate on them, and for a little while I could pretend I was home. When did you come here? I asked her. These were the first words she'd spoken to me, not laced with malice. I was 9 years old, she said, as old as Fatima is now. To pay back debts? There were no debts until they brought me here. Her expression darkened. I was traded in for the price of 6 goats and a cow for my eldest sister's wedding. My parents promised they'd come back to get me as soon as they repaid him. They didn't come? They came all right. Borrowed more money. Maybe they could have paid it all back, but then there was the money we owed for living here. What do we owe for living here? Don't you know? Nothing is free. Not the stale rotis, the bed we sleep in. Not for you and me, anyway. It's different for Mumtaz, Hamid, Tokir, and some of the others. They choose to work here. They get paid for the work they do, and can live here with their families. You and me? We aren't free. We work off our debts by working here, but the food we eat, the sheets on our bed, and the roof over our head are all accounted for and piling upon the original debt. But that makes no sense. If he charges us to live here, how can we ever pay it off? We can't. I thought of my father. He promised to bring me home as soon as he paid back the debts, but how could he pay Jawad Sahib if every minute I spent here made the balance higher than the day before? I sank onto a bench and tried to steady my breathing. Nabila was wrong. She had to be. But if she wasn't, did this mean I would never be free? My chest burned with the injustice of it all. Until that moment, I didn't know heartbreak was a real and physical breaking. It gets easier with time, I said. Look at me. Look at Fatima. Fatima has her father, I said. Hamid isn't her father. What? I looked at her. What happened to her? Why is she here? The youngest of 7 girls is what happened to her, Nabila said. Dumped here when she was 6 years old. Still remember the day, Nabila said. She curled up in the corner of the servants' quarters. I think Hamid must have looked like your father, because out of all of us she went running straight into his arms and clutched him tight. Called him Baba. Never saw him crack any real emotion until then. He's watched over her like she's his own since then. It wasn't fair, I wanted to say. But didn't my father always say life wasn't fair? Now I understood just how right he was.